Before dawn, on a muddy English airfield, a ground crew wrenches the last fuel line onto a battle-scarred P-47 Thunderbolt, frost on the wings, breath fogging in the cold. Hours later, that same aircraft is deep over German airspace when a 20mm shell tears through its engine cowling. 3 cylinders shatter instantly. Oil sprays across the windscreen, blinding half the pilot's view forward. By every rule of aerial combat, that plane should have gone down in under a minute. It didn't. The pilot nursed it home, 400 miles across hostile territory, and landed in England with the engine still turning, 7 of 18 cylinders firing. This wasn't a one-off miracle. It happened again and again, in hundreds of documented cases, from the hedgerows of Normandy to the industrial heartland of the Ruhr. The P-47 Thunderbolt weighed nearly 8 tons fully loaded, more than twice a Spitfire. German pilots mocked it as the flying milk bottle. On paper, it was the wrong airplane entirely. So how did the plane everyone laughed at become nearly impossible to actually kill? Republic Aviation's engineers knew what they were building the moment the numbers came back. A fighter almost 8 tons fully loaded, dwarfing everything else in the sky. Test pilots climbed into the cockpit and joked darkly that this thing could outdive any enemy fighter alive, because gravity, at least, had more airplane to pull down. Alongside the sleek, needle-nosed Spitfires and Messerschmitts, the Thunderbolt looked almost embarrassing. Bulbous nose, thick fuselage, a silhouette built more like a delivery truck than an interceptor. German pilots who spotted it climbing slowly into formation started calling it the flying milk bottle, a nickname that stuck because it was, on the surface, accurate. Even inside the U.S. Army Air Forces, doubt ran deep. Officers who'd built their careers on the gospel of speed and agility looked at the P-47's bulk and saw a mistake in the making. A plane too heavy to climb fast, too big a target to survive a real dogfight. Captured German intelligence reports later confirmed just how deep that skepticism ran on the other side, too. Analysts dismissed the Thunderbolt's engine as a throwback, a 1930s idea dressed up for a modern war. Nobody was lying about the numbers. The P-47 really was heavier, slower to climb, harder to miss. What none of them understood yet was that the numbers were measuring the wrong thing entirely. To understand why the P-47 looked like a mistake, you have to understand the religion it was breaking. In 1942, fighter design across Europe followed one commandment above all else: weight is the enemy. Every extra pound stole speed, stole climb rate, stole the tight turns that won dogfights. The British built the Spitfire around that principle almost devoutly. A slender, elegant machine weighing around 7,500 pounds, fully loaded. Its Rolls-Royce Merlin engine chosen specifically because its narrow, liquid-cooled design cut drag to the bone. The Germans went even further. The Messerschmitt Bf 109 came in under 6,900 pounds, built for one purpose: to climb fast, turn hard, and kill quickly before the enemy could react. Both aircraft were beautiful, in the way a knife is beautiful. Nothing wasted, nothing extra. And for years, that philosophy had proven itself in combat. Lighter planes climbing above heavier ones, outturning them, picking them apart from angles a bulkier fighter could never reach. So when the Thunderbolt rolled off the line, bucking every rule that doctrine had written, it wasn't just unusual, it was heresy. Pilots trained on the gospel of lightness looked at 8 tons of American steel and saw a plane built by people who hadn't gotten the memo, not realizing, yet, that the war was about to rewrite the memo entirely. The difference came down to something most pilots never thought about until it saved their lives: how the engine breathed. The Merlin and the DB605, the hearts of the Spitfire and the Bf 109, were liquid-cooled, a maze of tubes carrying pressurized glycol coolant around each cylinder, all of it feeding back through a single radiator tucked beneath the airframe. It was an elegant system, precise and efficient. It was also one small puncture away from catastrophe. A single rifle-caliber round through that radiator didn't need to touch the engine itself. The coolant would simply boil away, and within about 90 seconds, the engine would overheat, seize, and die, taking the aircraft down with it. The P-47's Pratt & Whitney R2800 worked on a completely different principle. 18 cylinders arranged in 2 rows, cooled not by liquid but by raw air flowing directly over finned metal. No coolant to lose, no radiator to rupture, no single point of failure waiting to be found by an enemy round. That distinction meant almost nothing on a spec sheet. It meant everything at 20,000 feet with tracers converging on your tail. One engine could be killed by a lucky graze. The other could take a direct hit, lose a cylinder outright, and keep clawing for altitude, wounded but alive. What made the R2800 remarkable wasn't just that it avoided the single failure point of a liquid-cooled engine, it was how much damage it could absorb and simply refuse to stop. 18 cylinders meant 18 separate combustion chambers, each firing independently, each capable of dying alone without killing the rest. A shell fragment could tear through one cylinder head entirely, silence it forever, and the other 17 would keep hammering away, the propeller still clawing at the air. Pilots described the feeling afterward, almost embarrassed by how mundane it sounded next to what had actually happened. The engine would start running rough. Chugging, some called it, like a machine with the hiccups instead of a fatal wound. Spark plugs could short out in banks. Sections of the ignition harness could be shredded by shrapnel, and still, more often than not, the propeller kept turning, dragging a crippled airplane back toward friendly territory on whatever cylinders were left willing to fire. In the case that opened this story, the Thunderbolt named Bonnie came home on 7 of 18. Less than half an engine by any reasonable math. But half an engine was still enough. Enough altitude, enough thrust, enough time in the air to cross the channel and put wheels back on English soil. That kind of redundancy wasn't an accident. It was the entire point. The engine was only half the story. Around that tough, air-cooled heart, the rest of the P-47 was built like it expected to get hit. Because it did. Roughly 245 pounds of armor plate wrapped the pilot from 3 directions. A slab ahead of him, another behind his seat, more shielding the oil tank and cooler that kept the whole engine alive. It was more armor than almost any other single-engine fighter of the war carried. Weight the lightness-first crowd would have stripped out without a second thought. Cartvelli and his team refused. Beneath the cockpit floor ran something just as important as any gun or plate. A massive duct feeding the turbo supercharger, built the length of the fuselage. That duct did more than boost the engine at high altitude, letting the Thunderbolt hold full power above 25,000 feet, where German fighters were already gasping for horsepower. It also meant the belly of the aircraft, the part most exposed during a strafing run, was reinforced structure instead of thin, vulnerable skin. And when it came time to fight back, the P-47 didn't do it quietly. 8 50 caliber Browning machine guns, each capable of firing more than 750 rounds a minute, turned every pass into a wall of lead. This wasn't a fighter designed to dodge every bullet. It was a fighter built to take a few and still win. Theory only means so much until it's tested against an entire war's worth of missions. The 56th Fighter Group provided that test. Known as Zemke's Wolfpack, after their commander Hubert Zemke, they flew the P-47 almost exclusively from 1943 to 1945, refusing to trade up to newer, sleeker fighters even as other American units switched to the P-51 Mustang. They stayed loyal to the airplane everyone else had mocked. The results silenced most of the doubt. Between 1943 and 1945, the Wolfpack claimed more than 1,000 enemy aircraft destroyed, making them the highest-scoring American fighter group in the European theater. What made that number even more remarkable was the other side of the ledger. Across those same 2 years, flying deep into contested skies again and again, they lost fewer than 130 of their own Thunderbolts to every cause combined. Combat, mechanical failure, weather, everything. That ratio wasn't luck sustained across hundreds of missions. Luck runs out. What held, mission after mission, was a machine that let its pilots survive their mistakes, absorb a bad pass, and fly home to fight again the next day. Every kill the Wolfpack claimed came from pilots who trusted their aircraft enough to press an attack a fraction longer than a more fragile fighter would have allowed. That trust, multiplied across an entire fighter group, is what 1,000 victories actually looks like. In June 1943, pilot Robert S. Johnson found out exactly how far the Thunderbolt could be pushed. An FW-190 latched onto his tail and stayed there, pouring fire into his aircraft for several long minutes, an eternity in air combat. By the time it was over, more than 200 rounds of 7.92mm machine gun fire had struck his plane, along with at least one 20mm cannon shell. The damage read like a list of everything that could go wrong at once. His hydraulics were shot out entirely, his canopy jammed shut, sealing him inside a wounded aircraft over enemy territory. One aileron was destroyed, stealing part of his control over the plane. His oxygen system was hit too, at an altitude where that alone could kill a pilot slowly and quietly. Any one of those failures might have ended the mission, and the pilot, permanently. Together, they should have been unsurvivable. Johnson flew anyway. He fought the crippled controls back across the English Channel, wrestling an aircraft that was barely still an aircraft, and landed it in one piece. He would later say simply that the plane just would not die. Johnson survived the war with 27 confirmed aerial victories. But it's this mission, not his highest scoring one, that pilots still talk about, because it wasn't a story about winning a fight. It was a story about what it took to walk away from one. The most convincing testimony about the P-47 didn't come from American pilots at all. It came from the men trying to shoot it down. Egon Meyer, one of the Luftwaffe's most experienced bomber killers, encountered the Thunderbolt repeatedly and reported something that should have unsettled his own command. Hits that would have destroyed a Bf-109 outright often left the P-47 wounded, but still fighting, still flying, still dangerous. Allied intelligence heard the same story over and over when they interrogated captured Luftwaffe pilots throughout 1944. Almost without exception, these men described needing far more ammunition to bring down a Thunderbolt than a Spitfire or a P-51. Rounds that would have torn apart a liquid-cooled engine, boiling away its coolant and seizing it within minutes, often did little more to the P-47 than reduce its horsepower and send it limping home instead of falling out of the sky. There's a particular kind of proof in an enemy's frustration. German pilots weren't offering praise. They were describing a problem. A fighter that refused to behave the way every other Allied aircraft did when it took damage. Somewhere over France and Germany, men who had spent years learning exactly how to kill an airplane were forced to admit this one had rewritten the rules on them, and nobody had told them where the new vulnerable spots were, because there weren't any easy ones left. None of this happened by accident. Alexander Kartveli, the P-47's chief designer, had built the aircraft around the promise of that turbo-supercharged radial engine from the very beginning, and he refused, again and again, to shrink the ducting or strip the armor to satisfy critics chasing a lighter, faster machine. Pressure came from every direction. He held the line anyway. What looked like stubbornness in 1942 looked like foresight by 1944. The war in Europe had changed shape. American fighters weren't just dueling one-on-one at medium altitude anymore. They were flying long escort missions deep into Germany, shepherding bombers through hours of exposure, and increasingly diving into flak-saturated ground attacks against rail yards, convoys, and armored columns. The most dangerous work a fighter pilot could draw. In that kind of war, an airplane doesn't take damage occasionally. It takes damage constantly. Commanders in the 9th Air Force noticed and started assigning P-47 groups specifically to the riskiest missions, the ones that would have grounded a Spitfire squadron for a week of repairs. That wasn't tradition or stubbornness on their part either. It was a lesson learned in blood. The airplane that keeps flying after taking a hit saves more lives, over the length of a war, than the airplane that wins one clean fight and never gets touched. Kartveli's refusal to compromise had built exactly the fighter that war required.